Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. So thanks Ulrich and all the other organizers for organizing this conference. I'm really looking forward to it. My name is Visala. I'm from the University of Helsinki. I'm working there as what they call an academy research fellow. So I just received 5 years full funding for a project on free will and science. And I'm just beginning this whole thing. And I'm here feeling this great awe and trepidation because I'm talking about a topic that I don't know at this point very much about. And when I look around, I see I see a few of my philosophical heroes in the audience who've been thinking about this issue. I mean, even before I was born. So I don't have anything groundbreaking or anything like that to say. I just want to introduce some of the ideas that I've been reading recently from a couple of philosophers. My own background is more in philosophy and theology. I've done some work on cognitive science, and there was some mention earlier on human nature. So I've done some work on that. I know very little of neuroscience, so I'm here to try to learn that. But I try to approach the issue now through some philosophers that have made some, let us say, cognitive science type things. So I know a little bit about that. So again, no beautiful graphs, no difficult stuff. It's the last talk of the day. I don't have any cool simulations to show or anything like that. So just a few boring ideas. And my topic now is: does the commitment to neuroscientific laws and models entail a commitment to neurodeterminism? And it seems to me that a number of philosophers do think that this is the case. Let's take John Searle, for example. So Searle, in his book Freedom and Neurobiology, he makes a couple of points. One, from basic deterministic physicalistic approach, he says this, that science somehow shows, he just pretty much states this, that macro-level physical events and systems have sufficient causal antecedents, and because brains are systems of these kinds, they must be the same. So brains are like earthquakes that have complete physical explanations. Brains are like any other states in nature, and then as such, everything that happens in the brains has sufficient causal antecedents. But then on the other hand, he says that free will is somehow indispensable. And what he means by that is that practical rationality entails a commitment to the ability to do otherwise. So he thinks that this is an ingrained thing. We human beings have this, and this is something that we always assume when we do whatever we do in practical life. We make choices, we think about things, we deliberate what to do, and so on. So this free will, from his point of view, is indispensable for our everyday life. So this, of course, creates a problem. And for Searle, the problem is simple. So how does a brain with no causal gaps might produce a decision-making process with causal gaps? Because you need these causal gaps, and then you have a brain that's not gapping, and then you have a decision-making process that is gapping. So then you have to somehow solve this problem. Okay, but the assumption here is simply that. Okay, yes. So he seems to assume, and I think he states this quite clearly, that a commitment to the scientific study of the brain entails at least some sort of a prima facie commitment to neurodeterminism, meaning the claim there are no gaps in the brain. But of course, why should we think this? And what I want to do next is to present a couple of ideas from a few philosophers. If I have time, I'll talk about two, but if I don't have time, I'll just talk about one. I've modularized this, so it's easier to control. So I start with one philosopher who makes a sustained argument that this is not really the case. And the idea, and this particular philosopher is an American philosopher called Stephen Horst. Some of them might have heard of Stephen. And to understand Stephen's project, one has to say a few words first on his overall view of the human mind and how the mind understands things. And this becomes relevant later in terms of what he thinks that neuroscientific models and laws actually are. So Horst's kind of general view is called cognitive pluralism. That's what he calls it. There's a new book out, as you can see. It just came out, I think, last year or the year before. And Horst's basic idea is that the human cognitive architecture, first of all, it's domain-specific and it's model-based. So human cognitive architecture works in such a way that there are a number of different cognitive mechanisms, and their job is to produce representations and models of certain specific aspects of the external world and so on. So there are all sorts of different systems, and they have very specific functions. So they're not general, they're very specific. And also his claim is that most of them are model-based, so they create all sorts of models, and I'll come back to what he means by models. And what's quite crucial for his view is that there's no central cognition, no central kind of Fodorian style cognition where all the representations from these other systems come together and form this kind of super representation or super model. I like the word super model. So super model of the world, so to speak. So he thinks that this doesn't exist, but these high-level reasoning processes, they are also parts of, they are also modular and domain-specific in this way. So from this basic point of view, he then deduces that everyday models that we use to represent the world in different ways, they are patchy, and they don't necessarily reduce to one another. So these models have their place in our everyday life and our everyday understanding, but it's quite difficult to reduce one model to another. And this creates a situation where you have a plurality of different models and they might have different uses, but you can't say how they clearly kind of map onto one another. And this is the big point. I'll kind of go around this a number of times. Again, in addition to this, so Horst thinks that science is just a more regulated version of everyday model building. So what people do in science is that they build models and come up with laws that are more regulated, more tested, and so on and so on. But what's essentially going on cognitively is the same kind of process that we have in everyday life. We build these context-specific practical models. And again, it follows from this the scientific theories and laws. I'll explain later what he means by that. They are domain-specific. They are idealized and they are pragmatic. Idealized in the sense that they abstract away from unnecessary details and focus on certain causal connections instead of others. And in this, the cognitive pluralism that he then espouses in terms of science means something like this, that we should have a pluralistic approach to science. And then he thinks that perhaps, he doesn't make the claim that it is necessarily the case, he said that perhaps science is such that scientific models and laws are patchy in the same way as everyday models and generalizations are, and they might not reduce to one large supermodel or theory of everything. And of course then he appeals to a number of different scientific developments also to support this. But he has at the same time a kind of argument from the cognition, the way that our cognition works, and then an argument from what we find from actual sciences. He uses a lot of different examples to illustrate this basic point. So here we have 3 different maps of Moscow. And from Horst's point of view, he would say that all of these maps serve a certain purpose. They have a certain function, and they help us to navigate the actual city. And they do, in their way, all represent the city in different ways. So there's the metro map up there, then there's a street map, and then there's a topographical map. So they all represent the city, yes, but they're all, literally speaking, false. So it's not, the metro lines don't really go like that. The streets, they're not really that wide. But those maps are useful for different purposes. And we can't just say that, okay, let's, take all these maps and make a great big map of everything, and then we'll have the whole thing. No. That doesn't seem to work. So they are true in their way, but we can't put them all together. We can't generalize we can't reduce one to another. Here are some pictures of metro stations in Moscow. If you've ever been there, they're extremely beautiful. And again, Horst uses this, well, he doesn't use this very example, but his point is that you can't just take all those pictures and then say, well, here we have a picture of the whole metro station. So we have all these pictures from different aspects of the station. Now let's put them all together and say, now we have this great big picture of the whole station. Pictures don't work like that. They represent the same aspects of the whole thing, but the pictures can't be reduced or put together. Okay. So now on free will. In his earlier book, Laws, Mind and Free Will, Horst applies this cognitive pluralism to issues related to free will. And the book has a number of different aspects. One is that he begins basically with a Nancy Cartwright style critique of empiricist style account of laws of nature. So he criticizes the idea that, first of all, laws of nature are somewhat universal and exceptionless. He attacks this view using all sorts of arguments that Nancy Cartwright and others have already used. One of these arguments is that laws of nature say nothing about the combinations of forces. So when you have different laws working at the same time, they don't say anything about that. So they don't say what happens. And another argument that's being used here is that laws taken literally are false. The application of laws to a system depends on an idealized model of the system itself. So you have to have an idealized model of what's going on. You have to restrict the kinds of causal influences that you take into account, and that produces an idealized setting. And then when you have laws, they only work if you have an idealized setting. But when you're idealizing, there's always already something left out. So again, then he argues that laws are part of models. So laws are parts of domain-specific models, and this, he makes the argument, happens also in physics. So it's not, there's no difference in this sense between, let us say, the hard sciences and then it's something else. Like so his point is to try to show that laws of physics aren't really that different from laws of biology or laws of neuroscience. And he says that this is a problem that we've had because we inherited this empiricist idea of laws being exceptionless and universal. And then he goes on to point out that even in physics we have all sorts of different theories that don't necessarily reduce to one another. We don't know what they actually say about whether determinism or indeterminism is true. And if this kind of patchy nature of laws is already true in physics, then it's even more true in contexts where we work with extremely complex feedback systems and like brains and human beings and biological organisms. So he says that let's forget this idea that laws are really universal and exceptionless, and let's take laws as idealized statements of potential partial causal contributors to real-world behaviors. Instead of these abstract laws that are supposed to apply universally, let's see laws more model-like. Let's say that they are idealized statements of potential partial causal contributors to real-world behaviors. And if this kind of causal account of laws is what we have, if we start applying this, then it turns out, on his view, that endorsing even fundamental physical laws itself doesn't really commit us to any kind of physical determinism, as I already said. And of course, this can then be applied to brains. He also says, this is an aside, I won't come back to this, he also says that in the free will literature, there are a lot of people who take laws as being universal and exceptionless in this kind, and he mentions a couple of names, some of them are present here. But he doesn't develop that criticism in a very detailed way, but he mentions this, and then he's a bit, I think he's a bit annoyed by this. But let's move on. So if this general account of laws and models holds, this cognitive pluralistic account, then it turns out that neuroscientific models and laws are like physical laws and models in the sense that they are patchy. They are idealized and then they're domain specific. And to point this out, he develops a number of different empirical or case studies. So he goes through a lot of research, but I don't really have time here to do that, and to be honest, I don't really understand it that well, so I'm not good, thank you, in explaining these kinds of things. But you can find the case studies in the book, and 1/3 of the book consists of case studies. So he goes through various models of vision, he looks at different theories of cortical dynamics, and then he tries to develop a view of folk psychology as a kind of model, a law-like thing. So his conclusion, given this pluralistic framework, is something like this: that neuroscientific laws and models, as we currently have them, and the kinds of models and laws that we're likely to have in the future, they entail no strict commitment to neurodeterminism. So even if we have, he doesn't use this terminology because he hates this, he would say, even if we had a kind of complete neuroscience, which he thinks that it's impossible, because by definition models and laws they are not complete. They are just, they do what they do in the best way possible, and that's that. There's nothing else there to be said about being complete. But even if we had, in some sense of the word, complete neuroscience, then that would not be enough to rule out all other causal influences or causal input or whatever happens, because we already have the whole idea of wholeness is based on these models and these laws, and they involve all these abstractions and idealizations. And then he basically makes the point that if one is committed, on his views, if one is committed to something like neurodeterminism, he thinks that the reasons are not really scientific, that they are more philosophical or metaphysical, something like general commitment to the causal closure thesis or something like that. And then he thinks that if you look at the actual neuroscientific theories and models, you can't infer determinism, especially neurodeterminism, from those. So it has to come from somewhere else. And then he goes on, of course, to criticize these metaphysical principles or ideas that are then being used to support this idea. This is what he says. If laws express potential partial causal contributors, then a commitment to a law or a set of laws leaves us absolutely agnostic with respect to what other causal contributors, lawful or spontaneous, there might be. Laws make no claims beyond their own limited domains, and because free will is of the relevant sort, libertarian free will, is by definition anomic. The laws understood as expressing causal capacities cannot say anything about it. This is not, of course, a proof that that the will is free, but it is proof that free will is consistent with a commitment to scientific laws properly understood. So Horst doesn't make the claim that we have free will. His basic claim is that even if we are committed to the existence of decent, good scientific study of the brain, and that study provides us with a number of models and laws of how the brain works, and we make good progress, this by itself gives us no reason to accept that the brains are really a deterministic system, that there are no gaps in the brain, that this is something that has to be decided on some other grounds, not on the grounds of what the neuroscientific models are. Okay, so I have 2 minutes left. What I'll do is that I'll just mention the other guy. So, if you haven't read it yet, you might as well read it after this. So Mark Gallagher wrote a nice book in 2010 called Free Will as an Open Scientific Problem. And he doesn't use the idea of models or anything like that, but he makes the same claim, that it's still an open question whether the brain is an indeterministic or a deterministic system. So he basically concludes that there is no good reason to think that the brain is a deterministic system. So we might as well be free in this libertarian sense. Again, that's his basic point. So I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much.